May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Growing up in Chicago, the Indiana dunes and the Michigan side of Lake Michigan were only about an hour and a half away. All up and down the eastern side of Lake Michigan, right down to the southern end where Indiana is, there are towering sand dunes and bluffs all along the shore. My family knew a number of people who had cottages at the tops of those bluffs, so we got to see a lot of sunsets from that point of view, looking across the lake. A favorite practice for watching the sunset, or perhaps it was just a favorite method for getting small boys to tire themselves out before bedtime. A favorite practice was to watch the sunset from the beach, and then just as the last top curve of the edge of the sun slipped down behind the horizon, to run up the wooden steps to the top of the bluff and turn around and see that the sun hadn't quite set yet at the top of the bluff, and then to watch it again. In this way, I was able to relate to the otherwise incomprehensible size of the earth. I could relate to it on a human scale. I could actually relate to the curvature of the earth. As I mentioned at the beginning of the service, this past Thursday was the Feast of the Ascension on the church calendar, the commemoration of the story that was told in our first reading just now. The resurrection of Jesus is what we celebrate at Easter. That's the transition from death into life, the discovery that when all reasonable expectations for good are gone, love brings life out of nowhere. That's the resurrection. And following that, Jesus spent 40 days showing himself to his disciples, helping them to relate to something that was incomprehensible. It started out on a very personal and small scale. One person by the empty tomb, two people on the road to Emmaus, and so on. Finally, after 40 days, Jesus ran the disciples up to the top of the dune so they could see that his resurrection was not what God did just about his death, but what God does about death all the time and everywhere. Jesus' ascension into heaven wasn't the resurrection, but it related to the resurrection and related it to the whole world. Today, along with it being not exactly Ascension Day, it's also not quite Memorial Day, the day on the civil calendar when we are asked to remember a specific group of people who have died and to find meaning and hope in their deaths. It is specifically the day to remember and honor those who died at war while serving our country in the military. We honor them for putting the good of others ahead of themselves and for the sacrifices they and those who love them made for our country. We find something like resurrection in the offering of their lives for the sake of the lives of others. And while there are still vets of World War II and Vietnam who were with their friends as they died, and while there are still widows and children of those who died on active duty, it is crucial to remember that this is the specific purpose of Memorial Day. Yet I can't help reflecting on the sacrifices that are being made right now by many in service to their country, even though we are not at war. It's important to keep in mind the ways this pandemic is not a war, but maybe it's also helpful to see the similarities. If doctors and nurses are like those who joined the military voluntarily, perhaps we can also see similarities between meat packers, store clerks, delivery drivers, and so on, between them and those who were drafted into the military, willing or not. They too made sacrifices. They too served the needs of others at great risk to themselves. Even those of us who are simply staying at home have made sacrifices by doing so, and the purpose is to keep others from getting sick, to break the transmission of the virus from one person to many others. There's another way in which this is a lot like war, and that is that there are those who don't have the option to engage in any of those sacrifices purposefully and who are exposed to the risks nonetheless, to people whose incomes, whose neighborhoods, whose circumstances prevent them from socially distancing effectively and who are at great risk for bad health outcomes. The New York Times points out that somewhere around 100,000 of us in America have died. Some of them have been doctors, some nurses, some essential workers, but mostly elderly and poor folks whose circumstances prevent them from practicing social distance effectively. Here's how it's not like war. We are not one group of people coming together to fight against another group of people. As polarized as our politics has become, the pandemic is not a war between two groups of people at odds with each other. Unifying us would be easier if it were, frankly. Somehow human beings are better at pulling together when we can identify somebody to push against. But all of humanity is threatened by this virus, and all of humanity stands to benefit if we make sacrifices in service to each other. Today we grieve those who have died, all of them, whether they were elderly or unemployed or working tirelessly on the front lines. They are precious in God's sight and should be precious in ours too. We also give thanks for those whose deaths came about as a result of the risks they took for the sake of others. So today, let's run up to the top of the dune and get some perspective so that we can see the curvature of the earth, so that we can see that the love of God is universal and shines like the sun around the globe, and that through God's love, all deaths are transformed into new life. Now, I'm going to do something I sort of thought about doing right before Krista plays a musical reflection. I'm going to read some words that normally go with music. I'm going to read the text of a favorite hymn. Krista, don't try to play this hymn afterwards. Play whatever you were going to play. But this is a beautiful text that is a favorite evening prayer hymn because it's cast at evening. But as I said, sunrise and sunset look an awful lot alike through the lens of a camera. And that's really kind of the point of this hymn. So just enjoy these words and then enjoy beautiful music that is related spiritually, but not necessarily some other clever way. The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended. The darkness falls at thy behest. To thee our morning hymns ascended, thy praise shall sanctify our rest. We thank thee that thy church unsleeping, while earth rolls onward into light, through all the world her watch is keeping, and rests not now by day or night. As o'er each continent and island the dawn leads on another day, the voice of prayer is never silent, nor dies the strain of praise away. So be it, Lord, thy throne shall never, like earth's proud empires, pass away. Thy kingdom stands and grows forever, till all thy creatures own thy sway. Don't be fooled by a little bit of triumphal sound to those words, but rather, again, know that we are part of something that offers our gratitude and praise to God for God's glory that shines all around the world. Amen.